So we are right at time. I have the pleasure of moderating this session. This is, I'm Janet Peace. I'm the head of advisory and policy for Anew Climate. I spent many years on climate policy, and I'm really excited about all the things that are going on today. It's not just what's going on within the all-of-government approach in D.C., it's also what's going on in the states and agencies. I mean, the IRA, the infrastructure bill, Treasury, IRS, SEC, USDA, CFTC. I mean, it's crazy trying to keep up with all of this. So we're not going to tackle all of those things here. What we're going to tackle is some of the big things that are out there right now. I've got a great panel to give you some insights into that. We have one panelist who's not here yet, and she may be running a little late, but we'll see. So the way we're going to run this panel is first, kind of an opening question, and then I've got some in my back pocket, and then I'm going to open it up to you guys, because I think you may have questions that these guys could also help you with, providing insight to. So again, Janet Peace, and I have Kristina Wyatt, who's the Chief Sustainability Officer at Persefoni. Persefoni is a large carbon inventory, carbon footprint provider, but before she joined Persefoni, she was at SEC and helped write the guidance that we were waiting for that came out just, last week, right?
6th.
Just to be specific, the 6th.
Yep.
And then next to her, we have David Gillers. David is the, he said not to say you're the chief of staff, but you're also the head or the director of the climate risk unit and also the chief operating officer for the CFTC. So he has a broad portfolio, and I'm sure he's going to elaborate on some of the things that Chairman Benham said this morning. And then next to him we have Bill Hohenstein. Bill is the director of the Office of Energy and Environment and the Chief Economist's Office at the U.S. Department of Agriculture. So we can cover a lot of ground here. And with that, why don't we just kick it off? And I'll just ask each of you, because there's just so much going on, why don't you talk a little bit about your involvement in things that either connect to the carbon market or climate mitigation, because that's what most of us at this conference are involved in.
Shall I start?
Please.
Great.
Kristina, you go first.
Thank you so much for having me. What a great panel. I'm so honored to be here with all of you. So Kristina Wyatt, Chief Sustainability Officer at Persefoni, as Janet said. So I really sit on the demand side. Persefoni helps companies to measure and manage their carbon emissions. We're a software company. And I'm a securities lawyer by background. I had worked for many years at the law firm of Latham & Watkins, and then during, when President Biden was elected, I went over to the SEC on a special assignment to work on the climate rule that ultimately was just adopted on March 6th. That's all about trying to ensure that investors have the consistent, comparable, decision-useful information about companies' climate-related risks that they need and they've long been asking for. Then I came to Persefoni because it became absolutely apparent that we really need to have tools to make it easier for companies to be able to measure and manage their emissions. And the goal is to have full transparency across the world and have an easy way for companies to be able to translate their activities, all the stuff that they do, into their carbon footprint. How does that relate to the carbon markets? Well, you have to know what you have in order to know how much you need to offset. So I'm sort of like the first step before you think about what you're going to offset.
Perfect. Thank you, Kristina. David?
Thank you, Janet. And can everybody hear me okay? So David Gillers, CFTC. And actually, before I get into it, I should just say, when prepping or thinking about this panel, I, of course, wondered to myself, in San Francisco, I assume folks are not wearing ties. But then I also realized that I will be on a panel with a kind of fellow government folk and said, well, this is what we do. So I'm happy to see that we're both following the government protocol.
You look good. You both look good.
As Janet mentioned, I lead our climate risk unit at the agency. And for many folks, I don't know if folks here this morning saw Chairman Benham, but many folks think, the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, why are you involved with the carbon markets? And so just to level set, as the chairman did, so our markets, our commodity futures markets, really have their origin in agriculture. And so we used to be part of the USDA until 1975. And even since 1975, we still have had a very close relationship with our farmers and ranchers. The original futures were agricultural commodity futures. And so there's always been this nexus between climate and climate impacts and our markets. And so in 2020, or 2019, I should say, the chairman formed an advisory committee on climate impacts on financial markets. And we issued a report in September of 2020, which at the time was under the Trump administration. Of course, then Commissioner Benham was a minority commissioner, so a Democrat. But this is really the first time that the federal government had come out and explicitly linked or discussed the impact of climate on financial markets. When he became chairman, we were really looking for a very specific way, jurisdictional to our markets, that we could engage. And around the same time, in 2021, the first voluntary carbon credit futures contracts were listed on our exchanges. And so that really gave us the opportunity and this jurisdictional hook to do a deep dive into these markets. And I'll talk kind of more specifically about everything we've done, but the most recent thing that we did was we rolled out proposed guidance for our derivatives exchanges when they think about listing contracts and what those terms and conditions are. We provide a list of considerations for our exchanges. So looking forward to discussing that and everything else.
Thanks, David. And before we go any farther, I want to introduce our last speaker, who I'm sure was in high demand getting in here, so it's probably stopped every 2 feet. Hey, Lauren. So Lauren Sanchez, she's a senior climate advisor for Governor Gavin Newsom. And just so you know, I've asked everybody to speak to their involvement in carbon markets, mitigation. You probably have a little bit that you can talk about there? Okay. All right. But before that, Bill, maybe you could go next.
Sure. Thanks, Janet. Bill Hohenstein with USDA, fellow Fed. When I meet with scientists, and I do a lot within the department, they do refer to me as the suit, so I have to live up to that. So I run a small office in the Office of the Chief Economist. We provide policy support to the Secretary. And climate change has been keeping us very busy. It's a priority for the President, for the administration, and personally for Secretary Vilsack. And we have a lot of work going on. So the mitigation portfolio really fits within our nationally determined contribution, our commitment to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 50 to 52% by 2030, which is now 7 years from now, and then ultimately stabilize emissions in 2050. Agriculture has a huge role to play, so do forests. When we look at what it's going to take to meet those commitments within the ag sector, we think about transforming agriculture and really redefining what conventional agriculture means. That's going to take a lot of investment. It's not going to be cheap, billions of dollars every year. So our strategy is really focused on how to pull together those investment streams. And so there are 4 main areas. So there's core funding that we get through the Farm Bill for conservation, energy, and forestry programs. We can use those to address sources of greenhouse gas emissions and opportunities to sequester carbon. We have 2 new pieces of legislation, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act. They provide very significant amounts of funding, but targeted through our programs to address greenhouse gas emissions. So not general, but really targeted funding, but public funding. And then but that's not going to be sufficient. And so a key part of our strategy is to partner with the private sector. And we're doing that in a couple of ways. We announced a $3.2 billion program called Partnerships for Climate Smart Commodities. And while it sounds like offsets, it's different in a significant way. What we're betting on is that the public cares about climate change and is willing to make purchasing decisions based on the greenhouse gas performance of the products they consume. And that includes food. So can we create low carbon beef, low carbon milk, low carbon bread, and how we go about doing that. So we initially, it all starts with the farmer, putting in place the practices that reduce greenhouse gas emissions, tracing them through the products that are generated, and developing markets for those low carbon products. And that can be everything from low carbon biofuel to things that you might see in the grocery store. It's been quite an adventure. We started off pitching this and saying, this, let's shoot for maybe a $100 million program. And the secretary came back and kept saying, bigger, we need to do more. And so we ended up with $3.2 billion in grants. We got $18 billion in proposals and a significant amount of private match, which was really encouraging. That doesn't mean we haven't given up on the fourth pillar, which is the private markets themselves. So working on offsets, scope 3 emission reductions, things like tax credits. And there we have some new authority. So Congress just in 2023, as part of the omnibus budget reconciliation bill, passed something called the Growing Climate Solutions Act. And that gives us new authorities to help assist farmer participation in the voluntary carbon offset marketplace. We've been very active. We've produced now 2 assessments. One was an assessment of how these markets are functioning, how you all are doing. And there are some big challenges, let me say, especially in the ag space. And then a second report basically saying, will this program be helpful? And we've determined that it will be. And we're going to do 3 things. One is we're going to look at the protocols, and we have a set of criteria for inclusion in the program. So the protocols, in order to be included, need to be consistent, reliable, effective, efficient, and transparent. And so we're going to be defining what that means and getting input from folks that are developing the protocols. And then, in addition, we'll be setting up 2 registries, a registry of technical assistance providers, folks that farmers can be confident, know what they're talking about, and a registry of third-party verifiers. So a lot of this is TBD. We're going to be announcing requests for input soon and doing formal rulemaking over the course of the year. So it's an exciting time for us.
Busy, huh?
Busy.
Just a little. And Lauren, you're not busy at all.
No.
No. Why don't you talk a little bit about what's on your plate right now?
Will do. And apologies again for arriving a little bit late. It's always a busy time here in California working on climate change. So good morning. My name is Lauren Sanchez. I'm the governor's senior climate advisor. You may be wondering why a state is on a federal panel.
Actually, did you see I changed the name?
Oh,
U.S.
thank you.
Policy Action.
Lovely.
I did.
Okay. Well, I was going to go down a rabbit hole of, I actually, earlier in my career, worked for the federal government, and both for President Obama and earlier for President Biden on international climate negotiations, and followed Article 6 very closely, which I know is near and dear to the crowd here as we negotiated the Paris Agreement. I think the other reason why it's important to have California potentially on a federal panel is the important role the state has played for decades now in really being the tip of the spear on climate and clean energy policies. Call us a testing lab or the frontier, but there are so many things that we pioneer here in California that then become models for other states and for our federal government. I think the governor was thrilled to see the Biden administration just today finalize the clean car rule, really accelerating the ZEV revolution that here in California we're very proud to have played a leading role in. And as it relates to carbon markets, as you all know, there's a small army of my colleagues from the Air Resources Board attending today, and they can go quite a bit deeper into carbon market rules and regulations through California's now over a decade-old cap and trade program. From the governor's office, I'm really responsible for shaping his climate agenda and making sure the state is on track towards our aggressive 2030 goal and carbon neutrality by 2045. A big part of that this year is the rulemaking CARB is currently undertaking on the cap and trade program and the low carbon fuel standard, as well as a variety of other initiatives, I would say, in our all of government approach to climate action across the state. So as it relates to carbon markets specifically, they all have the, I would say, deeper dive on what CARB is contemplating for this year. I will say, from the governor's office perspective, we also have the enjoyable role of negotiating with our legislature how to spend the revenue from cap and trade, which, for those of you who pay a lot of attention to California policy, we have a budget shortfall this year, which means that everyone spends a lot more time thinking about our greenhouse gas reduction fund and how to actually spend the revenue from cap and trade, which right now is around $4 to $5 billion a year. Over the last few years, we have injected over $32 billion in general fund towards all of our climate investments. We are so thrilled at the Biden administration's federal climate investments. Over $15 billion have come to California already. But as we look towards a different kind of general fund revenue scenario, there's a lot more attention on our cap and trade program and where that revenue is going. And the other, frankly, market-based mechanisms that California has, whether it's the low carbon fuel standard or our ZEV mandate and a variety of others. So that is a chief part of our job in negotiations. And then I would say one of my favorite parts of intersection with carbon markets is the work I get to do with my counterparts. I know the Washington team is here, or New York, other carbon markets standing up across the nation. And then a lot of our international climate engagement is around climate policy broadly, but specifically carbon markets in and around the world. I'll share a brief anecdote. The governor went to China last fall to cement a variety of climate partnerships with officials over there. And in several instances, there was a deep history of collaboration around emissions trading schemes, cap and trade, and carbon markets, ongoing discussions in China, first pilot and now national. It's a big topic of collaboration, obviously, with our Canadian colleagues and our colleagues in the EU. So a lot of, I like to think about the kind of outsized role, not only of our market here in the state and across the nation, but globally, a lot of interesting conversations as well. So yeah, let me wrap it up there. And apologies again for running late, but thrilled to be here.
No worries at all. So I'm going to start with you since you brought a few things up. Last year, a couple major bills the governor signed, 253 and 261. 253 was about requiring companies to do greenhouse gas inventory, scope 1, 2, 3, and goes farther than the SEC rule. Also, 261 was about climate financial risk, which was also included in the SEC bill. But there was another one, SB 390, that thankfully the governor vetoed. That was wonderful. Thank you very much for your, glad you guys did that. That same exact bill was being debated in the California Senate today, SB 1036, I think it was called. How does that come back like that? I mean, it's exactly the same bill. So are you guys watching that bill closely?
So I'll answer that question, but first point out, so the jealous part I have of our federal counterparts is I don't know how many bills make it to the president's desk each year, but I imagine it's a couple dozen maybe on a good year. In California, because of our wonderful collaborative colleagues in our state legislature, the governor has about 1,000 bills that land on his desk every fall. You can imagine how many of those are related to climate change broadly because of the vast public interest in the issue. So a number of bills moving through our legislature right now that, frankly, we have a small army of legislative deputies that are all tracking. So first off, the governor was incredibly proud to sign 253 and 261 last year. I know Chair Randolph is here engaging with a lot of folks on that. And actually, he, when announced that he would sign that bill, which was at Climate Week last year, specifically said that he would not cede the leadership role that California has played on climate change and will continue to play in terms of aggressive regulations, in this instance around climate risk disclosure, climate disclosure broadly, but across the board, deeply committed to making sure that we continue to lead on this issue. On 390, what I would say is tracking the bill very closely. Our formal comment on all legislations, we don't comment on it while it's pending. I would ask everyone in the audience who was concerned with that bill last year to engage our state legislature now, early, often. I think the veto, frankly, caught a number of people by surprise because there hadn't been a lot of vocal opposition during the legislative process. So for those of you that are concerned, there are plenty of opportunities to voice those concerns directly with authors or other members at committee hearings, and would ask you all to do that. It's always easier to engage on bills before they land on our desk.
Oh, I totally can see that. And I think it caught us by surprise. It caught a lot of folks in the market because it was just different. Mm-hmm. The title was Protecting Consumers from Junk Offsets. Well, who isn't for protecting consumers from junk offsets, right? I mean, it really causes doubt in the market when there's crud out there. So it was surprising, but it came to everybody's attention kind of at the last minute. So it was great, though, that the governor stepped in. And I think there is more attention this year. So anyway, let's move on from that. So thank you for that. I appreciate it. Hey, Bill, you mentioned the Growing Climate Solutions Act. Mm-hmm. Pretty darn exciting. What exactly do you think the problem is with getting small farmers and forests to actually participate in the market? Because the Growing Climate Solutions Act is supposed to help them actually access the money from the voluntary market. What's the problem? Why aren't they doing that?
Yeah, no, that was actually the focus of our assessment. So I'm sure you're all aware that there are challenges, especially within agriculture. So when we conducted our review, we found, we examined 55 protocols, the cookbooks for how to generate carbon credits in the ag and forest sector. Only 18 have ever generated a carbon credit. And so that means a lot of work went into generating protocols that are never being used. And so the question is why, right? And so the numbers just don't add up in the ag sector, especially if you're going to be applying the protocol down to the individual farm scale. So a farmer, if they're going to be, doing no-till or nutrient management, they might generate half a ton, maybe a ton per acre over a 500-acre farm. That's 500 credits. So very high transaction costs we found, both in terms of reporting, verification, registration, that quickly swamp the benefits. And so what we found, across agriculture is that the individual project size was tiny relative to where offsets are effective: forestry, landfills, synthetic gases. And the transaction costs per project, per credit, were very high. So it's not that there aren't opportunities within the ag sector. It's just the approach we need to be thinking about when it comes to offsets is going to have to step back and think a little bit differently. And that's one of the reasons why we're really interested in these criteria. So one of them is efficiency. So how to make the process more efficient. How to ensure quality, but at the same time, make sure we're not putting in, criteria and reporting responsibilities that are going to be overly burdensome. One of the solutions is scale. So can we actually think about larger projects where the project isn't a farm, project is 1,000 farms, and they're all doing similar things, and the MMRV and reporting is done at that scale. At that point, the scope and the scale of agricultural offsets could compete. So we're really excited about sort of where this is going. I think we've learned a lot about what's not working. And the encouraging sign is that some of the protocols that seem to be working are the newer ones. And so I think you all have learned as time has gone on, what works and what doesn't.
And I'll just say that there's a lot of work underway to look at the methodologies, like the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market, ICBCM, for example, has working groups evaluating methodologies for, effectiveness, durability, additionality. And so they've actually identified specific methodologies that they're considering now and specific methodologies they'll consider in the future. And hopefully they can help you in your assessment, because I think they've done a lot of the work that you're talking about, at least on the methodologies piece. And that brings me to you, David. You guys have held a couple roundtables. I think you have brought in anybody who's connected to the voluntary market. Really good roundtables, I might add. And you put out this guidance that the chairman said this morning was going to be finalized in June, right? What are you going to do next?
So, thank you for that. So, the guidance, as you indicate, was really a long time in the making. And maybe just take a step back and to just make sure it's clear. So we don't view ourselves as a climate regulator because we're not. So we're a financial markets regulator. And so we are limited by the Commodity Exchange Act, which is our enabling legislation. So we are obviously only able to regulate the markets and take action that Congress has dictated. That said, as I mentioned, because of the listing of these contracts, we do have this really unique, I'd say, hook or venue to approach these markets. The roundtables you mentioned, we started them back in 2022. We had a convening, the first of its kind, bringing all folks in the value chain of voluntary carbon credits and markets into the agency. We also had a federal panel where colleagues from USDA, State Department, the White House, Treasury, Department of Transportation, given their involvement in CORSIA, participated. And the question at that point was, what is it that we should be doing in these markets? We issued a request for comment and received about 1,500 pages of comments back. We followed that with another convening in 2023, a similar broad kind of makeup of participants. And there are really two conclusions that came out of all of this public engagement. So number one was use our enforcement authorities to the greatest extent possible. And number two, do something about standards. Now, some have suggested that the agency actually draft standards, but we don't have the authority to do that. And so also just for clarity, so we can regulate, or we do regulate, our derivatives markets and our exchanges. We have limited jurisdiction to reach down into the underlying, into the actual carbon offset market and establish standards there. We don't have the authority to do that. What we do have the authority to do with respect to the underlying is bring an enforcement action. And so it is a little confusing on the one hand to say we don't have authority to establish standards because we don't, but we could bring an enforcement action. And this is just the way our jurisdiction works. So on the derivatives markets, we have oversight, we're doing surveillance, we're getting daily trade volume and trade reporting, but on the underlying, we are not. However, if a whistleblower were to come to us and say, hey, we have some information to share with you that suggests fraud or manipulation, then we could bring an action because it would impact our markets. So this is kind of broadly our jurisdiction, and the lead up to the guidance that we issued back in December. And as the chairman indicated, Secretary Yellen came out with a very positive statement. Secretary Kerry also at COP28 something very positive about it. We are aiming to finalize it. I want to say June or July. I'll just give us a little space there, but yeah, most likely June. And then we are actively pursuing, the enforcement end. So we put out that whistleblower alert, and we formed the Environmental Fraud Task Force. And I think the two of those together, I would say the push of the standards and then the pull of the enforcement, hopefully the goal really is to elevate and support widespread adoption of standards for high integrity markets. And the goal there really is to support much more trading volume, liquidity in these markets, and ultimately what you get from those two things is price discovery. And I think at this point, that's the part that's been a little bit of a challenge. And we anticipate that with the kind of hallmarks of CFTC regulated markets, we can get to the price discovery, which really is the kind of hallmark of what we're trying to do.
And I was very happy in your guidance that you actually point to the key criteria that ICVCM has highlighted. And I think actually ICVCM is actually in a footnote. So it's great that you're actually looking around to see what other people are doing, and I think that's really helpful.
Can I just respond
Please.
to that? Because I think it's an important point you make, Janet. So we did not want to reinvent the wheel with this guidance, right? Again, we're not a climate regulator. We do not have the in-house expertise to develop our own standards or even suggest what that guidance should be. There are, as folks here well know, many efforts underway, and a lot of good work has been done in this field. So you referenced ICVCM and the core carbon principles, which we referenced in a footnote. We also referenced the California Air Resources Board and the tremendous work that they have done. So kudos to you and your colleagues. And finally, CORSIA, the International Aviation Scheme. And so we think, and if you look at the principles that we outline, none of them will be a surprise to you. They all kind of reference, or they are similar to already existing regimes. But we think that if there is a federal regulator requiring this or suggesting that our exchanges look to these principles as they list the contracts, we think that it could also help elevate standards globally.
Kristina. So, SEC. First, I just want to say, because this is a carbon markets conference, how do you think that disclosure, whether it's doing a footprint and putting it out publicly or SEC requiring that you tell people what your inventory looks like, how do you think that drives, or do you think it drives demand for carbon credits or even action?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think it does, but as David was saying with regard to the CFTC and its authority, the SEC's authority is quite clearly to regulate the securities markets and for the benefit of investors. And so that is the focus of the SEC's rules. But in the process, we actually did something that was quite similar to what David was just describing with regard to the CFTC's process. When we were drafting the climate disclosure rules, we looked to the various different standards that were out there, and we spoke to a lot of investors and issuers and NGOs and others to try to figure out, what would a good rule look like? And we drew very heavily from the leading standards that already existed. We were very deliberately not trying to reinvent the wheel. And so we ended up with a rule that draws heavily on the greenhouse gas protocol for purposes of defining how you measure and report your greenhouse gas emissions using the scopes 1, 2, and 3 that the greenhouse gas protocol defines, as well as the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures to think about your climate-related financial risks. Now, it turns out that while we were writing these rules, the rest of the world was sort of doing the same thing. So we have pretty good harmonization in the regulatory environment, as well as the standard-setting environment, around the greenhouse gas protocol and the TCFD. All of that, the SEC's rule is designed to help respond to investor demand for consistent, comparable, decision-useful information. So how does that relate to driving the carbon markets? It's certainly not the goal of the SEC. The SEC is really deliberately agnostic as to what companies are actually doing. They just want to make sure that investors get the information they need to inform their investment decisions. But having that more consistent, comparable, reliable information about what companies' carbon emissions profiles look like and what their climate-related risks are, as well as their strategies to address their climate-related risks, is all sort of table stakes. It's really important to figuring out, well, what are we going to offset? And so with that confidence in what companies actually have in their inventory, I think that that is a good starting point to help drive capital toward offsets, because once you have that confidence, you know what you have and what your plan is to decarbonize, then you can, with greater confidence, actually invest in offsets. And then also in the SEC rule, there's a fair amount of requirements that companies talk about what their plans are to decarbonize. If they've set carbon reduction goals or net zero targets, et cetera, the rules will require them to discuss how they plan to get there, including through decarbonization mechanisms, but also the use of offsets.
Okay, so I did count in the SEC's 800-page rule. There was over 350 mentions of the word offset. Pretty crazy if you're thinking about a rule about how to disclose and what are you disclosing. The other interesting thing to me was the fact that it combines both the TCFD and the disclosure. If you think about what California has, for example, there is the disclosure bill, which is 251, but there's also 1305, which the governor also signed. And that 1305 is disclose what offsets you're using, and then so if you're a seller, like Anew, we have to disclose our offsets that we sell in California. We disclose all of them are on our website if anybody wants to look. But if you're a buyer, you also have to disclose what offsets you're using and how you substantiate a claim. Pretty nice. That's 1305 in California. Lauren, on the governor's desk, he approved these bills, but there was no money to implement these bills. And I mean, the governor has really made a point of climate is a big issue for him. How is he going to keep going? I mean, how is he going to protect his legacy, if you will, if he's not funding a couple of these big initiatives?
It's a great question, and again, a hot topic of discussion in Sacramento right now. And I'm glad you raised 1305. I never looped that into the legislation that we've been able to work with the legislature on and pass. And we should do a whole sidebar on the legislation we were able to pass in 2022, which we codified our 2045 carbon neutrality target into state law, 90% clean energy by 2035 into state law, setbacks from oil production for homes and schools, 3,200 feet, a variety of bills. So it's been a very big, to your question on legacy, it's been a very big few years on climate change in California. And the governor takes deep pride in his role in leading a lot of the, frankly, bold, courageous action that the state has been able to take. Regarding the funding for the implementation, specifically around 253 and 261. So in January, we proposed the governor's budget proposal for the year. That is then revised in what we call May revise, based on fiscal projections and updated numbers, and then agreed upon with our legislature by the summer. So in January, given the severe budget deficit that the state was facing at the time, we actually held funding for all what we call chaptered legislation or recently passed bills and said, we will take a look at funding legislation, new legislation in May when we have updated fiscal numbers. So that is something that we are now, our Department of Finance is working eagerly on, so that in May we can take a hard look at which bills have been passed and do need funding and where that source of revenue would be. I know one thing that has been kicked around is perhaps funding 253 and 261 out of the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund or some other fund source that is less volatile than general fund in California. So that is a discussion that we will be having with the legislature over the coming months. It goes without saying that an author of one of those bills is our budget chair in the Senate, so I can expect that he will champion this, not to speak for him, but there are a number of, again, landmark climate bills that we've passed and funded at all of our agencies, knowing that we don't really, the work in California, as all of you know who are steeped within carbon markets know, goes so much further beyond the headline or the New York Times article. It's really about, we are 7 layers deep in implementation right now, and that takes an enormous amount of staff capacity and work with stakeholders across the state, just like we'll be doing across the nation and around the world on 251. I'd also like to point out, to the point of climate legacy, separate from funding. The governor gets to stand on proud shoulders of two other governors before him, Democrat and Republican, Governors Brown and Schwarzenegger, who also championed climate change in this state. It's not a new thing for our office to be prioritizing this issue. And I always reflect on, my time in the federal government and then coming to California is such a remarkable opportunity given the amount of political support for this issue, the amount of public support for this issue. The devastating wildfires, drought, and flooding in this state have meant that climate change has been a top issue for Californians and for voters over the last few years. And then at the end of the day, the enormous amount of support from our private sector for this issue. When you look at 253 and 261, a big part of the reason why they were able to pass our legislature is because of the business support for those bills. There was business support behind all of our strong, aggressive climate bills that we were able to pass. I even think about the executive order that the governor did on 100% zero-emission vehicles. It was Ford that called later that day and said, "We stand behind this." There's a long, proud history of working with committed stakeholders from a variety of sectors, including our business sector, that will help cement that legacy beyond the governor's time in office.
I firmly support engaging with the private sector. I think there is a lot of detail in these markets that folks like in this room can help with. Oh, did you think about this? Did you think about that? So congratulations on that. I know there are questions in the audience. I have many more questions, but I want to give you an opportunity to ask questions at this point. Otherwise, I will keep going. Oh, okay, we got a few. Jen, why don't you start?
Sure. Hi, Jen Jenkins from Rubicon Carbon. I have a question for Bill. It's really sort of like, as an expert, and you've been in this space for a long time, and what would you, what's on your wish list, right, of the most important innovations in measurement and monitoring in both forest and ag systems that would enhance quality in our VCM system, right? Based on your, because you guys have surveyed the landscape,
Yeah.
You know everything that's out there. What is missing?
Yeah, no, and that's not a hypothetical question, because within the Inflation Reduction Act, there's $300 million to improve MMRV. That's a big number, right? And so with it, and looking at how we're investing that money really does help define what the priorities are. And so a good chunk of it is going to go to standing up a national soil carbon monitoring network where we have permanent plots, at least 5,000. We're going to be taking soil samples, we're going to be assessing soil carbon, and we're going to be doing that as infrastructure. So that those plots will go back to every 5 years. We'll be getting the management data and using all that information to calibrate the models that everyone relies on to assess soil carbon. So that's a big investment. We're also going to be doing field trials for nitrous oxide and methane across the board for technologies, creating protocols so that the innovators, the folks that are generating the next set of technologies on feed additives or enhanced efficiency fertilizers, can take the methodologies that we're using, do their own research with land-grant universities, do it using the same methodologies, and we can compare the results. So those are really important things in the ag space. In the forest space, really understanding the effects of disturbance and the effects that disturbance are having on forest carbon stocks, and keeping the data current. And that's also a challenge in the ag space as well. I would say, if you look at our inventory, the data that's in it, in some cases, the practices, the assumptions about what's actually happening on the landscape is sometimes up to 5 years old. And so, while we've seen a lot of adoption of climate smart technologies in the ag space, it hasn't quite shown up in our inventory yet. So we've got a lot of work to do. The good thing is we have resources to focus on it, and we've got big plans.
That will really help. I mean, MRV, especially for small farmers, small landowners, if you can give them some help, I think that would help mobilize more in that space. There were a few questions in the back. We'll go into the back, but nobody there? Who's up here? Here, Robert, you want to go? Sorry.
Robert Parkhurst, Sierra Solutions. So the question I have for all of you is, you've all got ambitious goals or worked on ambitious goals. What's the one thing that keeps you up at night?
Oh. Can I start?
Sure.
Lack of demand, fear of taking action. Companies right now are keeping their heads buried because they don't want to be sued for greenwashing. They're afraid that if they buy a carbon credit, there's somebody out there who's going to criticize it. But we need confidence in these markets to be able to direct finance to the projects that actually matter. So getting demand back up, just keeping me awake a little bit. Sorry, I had to jump in there.
No, that's great. I would say time, right? I mean, I think we will get there. I see a world where we have viable, economically viable solutions. We have transparency. We understand companies' emissions broadly, their scope 3, their value chains, how they're offsetting those emissions. I see that world. I think it will develop, but we're running out of time. So time.
I was going to say there are many more things. There's not just one thing that keeps me up at night, but I will limit this then. I really don't know where this is all going to head, and by that I mean to pick up on something that Lauren had mentioned. There seems to be broad support from the business community for and even for what California is doing, and I'm sure for what USDA is doing from farmers and forest owners and landowners. Broad support from kind of across, I would call it, the political spectrum. What I am concerned about is whatever happens in future elections, so not necessarily this year, but just going forward over the next decade, 15, 20 years, it's not clear to me that the kind of practical, pragmatic, 80% majority of the country will actually be successful in implementing the policies that they like, and my concern or fear is that, let's just say, politics can get in the way.
I don't think people realize how devastating flip-flopping government policies are to investment decisions.
Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't mean to just cut you off there.
No, I absolutely agree. We this has never happened to me before, and I was in the Senate for about a decade, and then at the agency for 5 years. I've never had this experience until the carbon markets. We had folks from the ag industry walk in and say, I've never asked for the government to step in and regulate a space, but you need to do something in these markets. They're growing, they're evolving, we just need a little bit of a steer. And so my sense is that there really is kind of widespread interest in everyone getting behind this, but it's not clear if that's going to happen.
Bill, are you sleeping well at night? Or?
No, not particularly. So let me just talk quickly about two things. And I think one, building on Jen's point, and this is maybe the optimistic thing that keeps me up at night, that given the state of our inventory, we may actually achieve our goals and not know it, right? And so we may get to 2030 and be making progress across the sector and not be able to tell that story because our systems for collecting all that data and information and getting it into our inventory are not where they need to be. I think the bigger issue is sort of having the perfect be the enemy of the good, right? And the Europeans are really fond of the precautionary principle, and I get it thrown at me quite a bit. But when we think about climate change and the precautionary principle, we almost have to flip things on their head, right? Because there is a cost of waiting until we have everything figured out exactly, right? And so while you might say it'd be precautionary to say, well, we don't know enough about soil carbon, we don't know enough about this source of agricultural emissions, we don't have a whole lot of time. And so we do need to act and learn and act some more. And so that also keeps me up at night.
Me too. Lauren?
So I'll second the answer around time. We've seen entire towns wiped off the map here in California due to wildfire over the past few years, and it does just feel like we're running out of time every day. But what keeps me up at night is actually a positive feedback loop that I think we're at risk of falling into in California, which is the socialization of climate costs and then the politicization or losing public support for climate action. And I give a few couple of examples, whether it's insurance costs or electricity bills in California, which right now are carrying a lot of wildfire mitigation. We have seen increasing costs across the state, the cost of housing going up because we're limiting where you can build because of wildfire risk. So you see a number of consumer costs increasing in California. Very easy for opponents of climate action to say that's because of the governor's climate agenda, or that's because of our moves towards 100% clean energy. Californians are already paying embedded costs and increasing food prices from food shortages around the world due to climate change and droughts. I was just reading about chocolate prices skyrocketing, for example. So I think we, are socializing costs without talking enough about, for example, the social cost of carbon, the cost of inaction on this issue. I always refer to a single data point. Cleaning up the Paradise Fire in California, our most deadly was $3 billion alone. And we didn't blink. We had to clean it up. If you think about what $3 billion could do in incentives for heat pumps across the state, I mean, it's a massive amount of money. And it feels like we are socializing costs at the same time where we are asking consumers to make some pretty difficult transitions with us as well. And of course, our business, industrial partners across the state as well. So I worry about the opportunity for politicization of the agenda while we're in that hard part of the transition.
The opposition points to rising gasoline prices, your LCFS program, your cap and trade program, just increasing gasoline. Gasoline prices that's just not the issue.
And we could have a whole panel on that.
We could have a whole panel on that. But it's a little crazy. And if there's, this is a group of, I would say, climate friendly. If there's things that this audience could do to help you with that, you should let us know.
Thank you.
One more question back in the back.
All right, so I'm a farmer, and basically what happens is we get a lot of this fun stuff coming our way, especially from like Walmart and everybody who buys our products because we've centralized our grocery stores. You guys were talking about food prices and all that fun stuff. Well, I can tell you right now, out of $2.99 per pound of an apple that you pay at the grocery store, 48 cents goes to the farmer, 58 goes to the packer, and the rest goes to Walmart. So when you guys talk about providing these carbon-safe products and all this stuff, we're the ones paying for the packaging. We're the ones doing all that. We don't get added price, and then Walmart gets all the credit. So I have a question for you guys. How do you guys plan to help actual producers who don't have time to manage the 18 different programs that the USDA has? I'm probably the most knowledgeable one in tree fruit, and that's why they sent me down here, just to figure things out. Yeah, I'm a functional analyst and a tree fruit breeder. Any of the apples that you guys eat probably come from one of my companies that I work for. So my question, I guess, in general is, how are you guys, moderating, the little guys? Because you put all these stipulations. What's the $1 billion mark for, having these companies report? I was like, as a farmer, I don't have that ability. And then if I have a disease, it cuts down my crop. So suddenly I can't rely on my carbon credits I was going to pay for stuff. And then I'm having to continue to do these things. And then it knocks me out. Then I have to pay again to get back into the program.
I think we hear you loud and clear here.
And the worst part is probably some of the people in here as salesmen for carbon credits don't understand what they're talking about, especially not with farming. I spend half my day explaining farming to people.
This is why Bill's list of who are good service providers, who are good verifiers, and also what you're doing to actually help with small to medium-sized farmers is super important. I'm sorry, I'm jumping in for your answer. Go ahead.
I think that might have.
Is that your answer?
Take a shot at that?
Okay.
Hey, great that you're here. I think I was not expecting to run into farmers today, so that's great. Really appreciate it. This is really at the core of what the Secretary talks about when he talks about his vision for agriculture. And it really is focused on small and mid-sized producers and creating.
What's the size of that? What is the market? Because corn, $800 an acre to produce, it's $25,000 an acre to produce apples.
Yep.
So just I was gonna say, I'm trying to be a farmer and the small farmer and grant stuff, $500,000.
Right. So let me just let me just say that part of this is building resilience in these rural economies and creating more markets and more market opportunities. So when the Secretary talks about farming and making farming viable so farmers don't have to take second jobs, it's creating additional value streams, so local markets for your products, building in markets for biofuels and bioenergy, creating markets for bio-based products, creating environmental markets where you can get credit not just for the carbon but also for the water quality benefits. In order for this to work, it has to be simple enough for you to be able to do it, because making it overly complex means that it just isn't going to work. And I think we've learned that with some of the carbon offset protocols that we've seen.
It's a good question, and how you get to small to medium is not easy. But I think what some of the things you're doing, I think that's really going to help. I mean, aggregation, the cost of bringing a bunch of farmers together, it adds up, and it makes it almost impossible to do some of those types of projects. I have to say we're out of time for this panel. Hopefully this has been interesting and useful. I think we could talk on this topic for another 2 hours. But I suspect our panelists have other places they have to be. But please join with me in thanking these guys for spending some time with us.
Thank you.